There's a nursery rhyme almost every American kid grows up hearing, even if most of them have no idea where it came from. Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. It's been chanted on playgrounds for jump rope games, printed on souvenir t-shirts, parodied in comedies and horror films alike for more than a century. There's just one problem with that rhyme. Almost every number in it is wrong. The woman named Lizzie Borden was never convicted of killing anyone. The mother in the song was actually her stepmother, struck around 18 to 19 times, not 40. The father was struck 10 to 11 times, not 41. And in the more than 130 years since that fateful morning, no one, not Lizzie Borden, not anyone else, has ever been officially convicted for the two bloodiest deaths in 19th century American criminal history. This is Fall River, Massachusetts, where a real murder with two real victims got turned by pop culture into a jump rope joke, a souvenir t-shirt, and now a hotel where you can pay to spend the night in the very room where the killing happened. If you're listening to this to relax, just let the voice carry you along naturally. This is the oldest story in the entire Marked series, older than cars, older than telephones, older than the very concept of true crime as an entertainment genre. But the questions it left behind are just as unresolved today as they were back in 1892. Unlike most other episodes in this series, this isn't the story of a killer who got caught, confessed, and was convicted. This is the story of a trial that happened, a jury that reached a verdict, and a question that has stayed wide open for more than a century and a half since. We won't be able to give you a tidy ending at the close of this video, because history itself never got one either. By the late 19th century, Fall River was one of the wealthiest, busiest industrial cities in New England. Dozens of textile mills lined the rivers running through the city, drawing thousands of immigrant workers from Ireland, Portugal, and Quebec to work in noisy fabric mills around the clock. Mill whistles sounded steadily every morning, noon, and evening, marking the rhythm of a city built entirely around looms that never stopped running. This was a city of industrial soot and the clatter of machinery, but it was also a city that produced no small number of Massachusetts' wealthiest families, mill owners, bank presidents, real estate investors who turned the textile boom into enormous personal fortunes. Andrew Jackson Borden was one of them. At 69, Andrew Borden was one of the wealthiest residents of Fall River, holding stakes in several local banks and owning a large amount of commercial real estate across the city. But there was a paradox anyone who knew the Borden family always brought up. For all his wealth, Andrew Borden was famous throughout Fall River for being almost unbelievably cheap. He refused to install modern indoor plumbing in the house, despite easily being able to afford it, leaving the family to use an old-fashioned basement toilet for years after most of their neighbors had running water. He refused to install electricity, refused the kinds of comforts a family of his wealth should have had for years. The family home, at 92 2nd Street, sat in the city's bustling commercial district, near the mills and shops, not on The Hill, the fashionable neighborhood where most of Fall River's other wealthy families had moved. It was an odd choice, and for Lizzie, his younger daughter, it was a quiet, simmering source of shame for years, watching friends from her own social class live up on that hill while she had to live amid the noisy commercial district. The house at 92 2nd Street was a modest, two-story wooden home by the standards of a wealthy family at the time, with no connecting hallway between the upstairs rooms, meaning that to get from one room to another you typically had to walk through a different room first. A seemingly minor architectural detail, but one that would become critically important in reconstructing the fateful morning of August 4, 1892. Andrew Borden married his second wife, Abby Durfee Gray, in 1865, 3 years after his first wife, the biological mother of his two daughters, Emma and Lizzie, died. Abby was 64 when she died in 1892, a woman many described as gentle, quiet, spending most of her time around the house. But between Abby and her husband's two daughters from his first marriage, Lizzie especially, a genuinely warm relationship never developed. Even years after Abby had become a permanent fixture of the family, Lizzie still insisted on calling her Mrs. Borden instead of mother. A small but telling detail the prosecution would later try to use in court as evidence of just how cold the relationship between the two really was. The real tension in the Borden household, according to many later researchers, wasn't really about affection. It was about money. A few years before the murders, Andrew Borden had quietly transferred a piece of family property to Abby's side of the family, infuriating Emma and Lizzie, who believed most of their father's estate should rightfully go to them, his biological children, rather than to the stepmother's family. There were bitter arguments in the house over inheritance, to the point where, for a time, the family took meals separately. Andrew and Abby ate in the kitchen, while Emma and Lizzie ate in a separate dining room, despite living under the same roof. Two things happened in the months before the murders that, when looked at together afterward, made a lot of investigators and the public do a double take. The first happened in the summer of 1891, a year before the murders, when cash and jewelry were stolen right out of Andrew and Abby's bedroom while the whole family, including Lizzie and Emma, was home. A local merchant had previously accused Lizzie of shoplifting, so she immediately became the prime suspect within her own family for the theft, though no evidence was ever made public. From that day on, every door in the house, inside and out, was kept locked at all times, a habit that would become critically important a year later, when police tried to work out how an outside intruder could possibly have gotten in without leaving a trace. The second incident, stranger and far more symbolically loaded, happened just 3 months before the murders. Lizzie kept a flock of pigeons in a coop in the barn loft, having built them a roost herself as a personal hobby. Andrew, believing the pigeons were attracting neighborhood boys who kept breaking into the barn to catch them, and worried they might get hurt or start a fire, decided to handle the problem his own way. He took a hatchet and cut off the heads of the entire flock right there in the coop. Lizzie, who had cared for those birds as pets, was described by many as deeply upset and angry at her father's actions. On its own, this detail proves nothing about the murders that followed, but it has become one of the most frequently cited pieces of the puzzle in more than a century of debate over Lizzie's possible motive. Whether the father who once used a hatchet to kill the animals she loved might also later have been killed with that very same kind of weapon, and whether that was coincidence or a form of symbolic retribution. Tension over the family's finances kept escalating in the following months, too. After Abby's side of the family received a house from Andrew, Lizzie and Emma demanded, and received, an equivalent rental property, only to turn around and sell it right back to their own father for cash, a decision that shows just how much the family relationship had come to be governed by financial calculation rather than affection. Shortly before the murders, a brother of Andrew's late first wife, the sister's own maternal uncle, visited the house to discuss transferring yet another piece of property, adding to the already suffocating atmosphere in the home. A bitter family argument in July 1892, just weeks before the murders, drove both sisters to leave the house, taking an extended vacation in New Bedford. When Lizzie returned to Fall River, rather than going straight home, she chose to stay at a local rooming house for 4 days before actually moving back under her parents' roof. A small detail that says a great deal about just how reluctant she was to return. Just days before the murders, the entire household went through a mysterious bout of food poisoning. Andrew, Abby, the maid Bridget Sullivan, and even a houseguest, Lizzie and Emma's uncle John Morse, all violently ill through the night. Abby, worried someone had poisoned the whole family, even went to see the family doctor to ask about it, a detail many later viewed as an eerie omen of what was coming, though the official cause was attributed to a pot of mutton stew left out overnight in the summer heat. Lizzie Andrew Borden, born July 19, 1860, was 32 at the time, unmarried, living with her father and stepmother, actively involved in church and local charity work, the picture of a proper Victorian lady by every social standard of the day. Her sister Emma, 41, also unmarried, lived with the family too, but on the day of the murders happened to be visiting friends in the nearby town of Fairhaven, entirely removed from the scene. Thursday morning, August 4th, 1892, began like any other sweltering summer morning in Fall River. Andrew Borden went out to handle his usual business errands around 9 a.m., while Abby stayed home tidying the guest bedroom upstairs, the very room that would, within hours, become the scene of one of the two murders. Sometime between 9 and 10:30 a.m., forensic examiners later determined this from blood clotting and stomach digestion, someone attacked Abby Borden with an axe-like weapon right in the guest room she was tidying, striking her head and neck roughly 18 to 19 times. She fell face down on the floor beside the bed and died almost instantly. No one in the house heard anything unusual. Bridget Sullivan, the family's Irish maid, was outside washing the ground floor windows on Abby's instructions from earlier that morning. Lizzie, according to her own later statements, was somewhere in the house or the yard, though her account of exactly where she was during this window would keep shifting across multiple rounds of questioning, one of the most damaging details against her later on. About an hour and a half later, when Andrew Borden came home around 10:45, he wasn't feeling well and lay down to rest on the sofa in the downstairs sitting room, with no idea his wife had been dead upstairs for over an hour. In the short window before 11:10 a.m., someone approached him as he slept or dozed on the sofa and struck him 10 to 11 times in the head and face with the same type of weapon, with enough force that one blow nearly split his face in two, and one of his eyeballs was cut in half by one of the strikes. The first person to discover Andrew Borden's body was Lizzie. She called out to Bridget Sullivan, who was resting in her room in the attic, screaming that her father was dead. "Somebody came in and killed Father," she said, according to multiple accounts from the earliest witnesses on the scene. Bridget immediately ran to fetch help from the neighbors, while Lizzie remained behind, notably composed, a calm that would become the subject of fierce debate for more than a century afterward. Was it a sign of severe psychological shock, the kind of freeze response trauma can trigger? Or was it a sign of someone who already knew what had happened? A neighbor, Adelaide Churchill, was one of the first people on the scene. When she asked Lizzie where her stepmother was, Lizzie said she thought Abby had received a note asking her to visit someone who was sick and had gone out earlier that morning, though no such note was ever found, and no witness ever confirmed sending or seeing one. It was Churchill, along with Bridget, who then went upstairs looking for Abby, and found her body lying in a pool of blood right next to the bed in the guest room. The Fall River police were called shortly after. What baffled officers from the very start, there was no sign of forced entry anywhere. The front door was always kept carefully locked per Andrew Borden's habits, and the ground floor windows were shut tight against the summer heat. If a stranger had broken in to kill both husband and wife, he'd have had to do it without leaving a single trace of forced entry, while also somehow avoiding the notice of Bridget, who was washing windows right outside for most of the morning. In the days right after the murders, Lizzie Borden was questioned repeatedly by police, and later at a preliminary inquest before the district attorney. Her account of where she'd been during the window when her stepmother was killed kept shifting with each round of questioning. At times she said she was in the backyard eating pears, at other times that she'd been up in the barn loft looking for lead to make fishing sinkers, an activity no witness had ever seen her do before, and one where the barn's loft floor, according to the police chief's later courtroom testimony, was covered in a thick layer of dust with no fresh footprints in it at all. There was another detail that especially caught investigators' attention. Exactly one day before the murders, Lizzie had gone to a nearby pharmacy trying to buy prussic acid, an extremely potent poison, reportedly to clean a sealskin cape. The pharmacist, a man named Eli Bentz, didn't think that was a sensible use for the acid and, since the law required a prescription anyway, refused to sell it to her. This detail, suspicious as it was, would later be excluded from the actual trial on a legal technicality. But during the initial investigation, it pushed police increasingly toward suspecting the victim's own daughter. During the investigation, a few other witnesses offered scattered, contradictory pieces of the picture. An ice cream peddler testified to seeing a woman, quite possibly Lizzie, coming out of the barn, lending some support to her account of having been there. But at the same time, the police chief, searching the barn loft, found the thick dust on the floor completely undisturbed, directly contradicting Lizzie's claim that she'd just climbed up there looking for fishing sinkers minutes before finding her father's body. At the preliminary inquest, when asked whether she got along with her stepmother, Lizzie notably dodged the question, only confirming that she always called her Mrs. Borden, never Mother, despite Abby having been part of the family for nearly 30 years. The maid, Bridget Sullivan, when questioned, also confirmed that the two sisters rarely ate meals with their parents, a detail suggesting a day-to-day distance within the family far greater than what a typical household of the era usually let show on the surface. 3 days after the murders, while police were still keeping watch on the house, a neighbor spotted Lizzie burning a dress in the kitchen stove, saying it had gotten paint on it and was no longer wearable. When questioned, Lizzie explained she'd asked Emma's opinion before burning it, and that police had had plenty of time to examine the dress if they'd wanted to. But to a public following the case through the newspapers, burning an item of clothing in the middle of a murder investigation, whatever the real reason, looked a lot more like destroying evidence than an innocent coincidence. On August 11, 1892, 1 week after the murders, Lizzie Borden was formally arrested. On December 2 of that same year, a grand jury indicted her on both counts of murder. Throughout her time in custody awaiting trial, Lizzie received treatment fairly unusual for an ordinary criminal suspect of the era, partly because of her family's social standing, partly because of a widespread belief in Victorian society that a lady from a church-going, educated, middle-class background simply couldn't be the kind of person capable of such savage violence. That very social belief, not just the evidence, would go on to play an enormous role in everything that followed in the trial to come. Lizzie Borden's trial opened on June 5, 1893, in the city of New Bedford before a 3-judge panel of the Massachusetts Superior Court. It was one of the most heavily covered trials in 19th-century American history. Reporters poured in from across the country, running daily front-page coverage in most major newspapers, turning Lizzie Borden into one of the most famous names in America within just a few weeks. One of the most dramatic moments of the entire trial came in its opening days, when lead prosecutor Hosea Knowlton, or, by some accounts, assistant prosecutor William Moody, while delivering the state's opening argument to the jury, laid Lizzie's blue dress out on the table in front of her, then suddenly produced 2 boxes containing the actual skulls of Andrew and Abby Borden to illustrate the severity of the wounds. Reporters present described Lizzie as fainting on the spot at the site, staying unconscious for several minutes, shaking the entire courtroom and visibly rattling the prosecution's own team. That moment, shocking as it was, inadvertently became one of the defense's strongest psychological arguments. A woman who had genuinely killed her father by that method, they argued, would be unlikely to react with such raw, apparently genuine anguish at the sight of the victim's own remains. The defense team, led by George Robinson, a former governor of Massachusetts, a deliberate and politically savvy choice of counsel, built their strategy around 2 main pillars. First, they argued that the entire prosecution case was purely circumstantial. No witness had actually seen Lizzie commit the act, and not a single drop of blood was ever found on her body or clothing right after the murders, despite the sheer brutality of both killings, which surely would have sprayed blood onto whoever did it. Second, and perhaps more importantly, they leaned hard into the gender bias baked into Victorian society, that a young, unmarried woman from a respectable background simply lacked the physical and psychological capacity to commit an act of such savagery, especially against her own father. The defense also won 2 decisive legal victories before the trial even truly got underway. The judge excluded Lizzie's contradictory testimony from the earlier inquest, testimony that, had it been presented to the jury, would have clearly exposed the inconsistencies in her account. The judge also excluded evidence of her attempt to buy prussic acid the day before the murders, ruling it wasn't directly relevant to the actual weapon used. With the prosecution's 2 most important pillars of evidence thrown out, what remained was purely circumstantial. A soot-covered hatchet head found in the basement that might have been the weapon, and a burned dress that might have had blood on it, but both left far too much room for reasonable doubt. On June 20, 1893, after about 90 minutes of deliberation, the all-male jury found Lizzie Borden not guilty on both murder charges. The crowd gathered outside the courtroom cheered. Much of the public, especially middle-class women across America, had followed the trial with deep sympathy for Lizzie, seeing her as the victim of an unjust prosecution targeting a defenseless, single woman within a legal system entirely run by men. Many modern legal historians looking back at this trial point to a striking paradox. The very gender biases that limited women's power and voice in Victorian society, women weren't allowed to sit on juries, weren't considered to have full independent legal standing in many areas of life, were exactly what saved Lizzie Borden from a death sentence. All 12 jurors were men, and to them, the image of a proper lady, neatly dressed, active in her church choir, taking a hatchet to her own father's skull, was simply beyond their moral imagination, no matter how compelling the circumstantial evidence might have been. That same weight of evidence, many researchers have since argued, could easily have produced a very different verdict had the defendant been a man, or a working-class woman without Lizzie's respectable bearing. No one else was ever charged for the deaths of Andrew and Abby Borden. Legally, the case closed right there. But the question of who actually did it was never answered in any way society broadly accepted. Being acquitted in court, it turned out, was an entirely different matter from being welcomed back by the community. Using part of her inheritance, Lizzie and Emma bought a large, elegant house right on The Hill, the very upper-class neighborhood Lizzie had longed to live in as a child, but which her father's stinginess had always kept out of reach. Lizzie named the new house Maplecroft, even having her name carved into the front doorstep, an act many at the time saw as suspiciously arrogant rather than the humility people expected from someone who'd just been through a sensational murder trial. But despite the acquittal, most of Fall River's upper-class society never truly welcomed Lizzie back into their social circle. Many of the churches and charitable organizations she'd once actively participated in quietly distanced themselves from her. Church leadership reportedly found tactful ways to reduce her role in shared activities. Kids in the neighborhood were said to sing mocking versions of the rhyme right outside her house whenever they passed by. Shops around town, by some accounts, would occasionally forget to serve her or deliberately drag their feet. Lizzie spent most of the rest of her life in near total social isolation, even though she was never wanting financially, a punishment that came not from any courtroom, but from the very community she'd been born and raised in. A quiet, sustained sentence, more enduring than any verdict. The relationship between Lizzie and Emma, the two sisters who had gone through that entire legal nightmare together, also gradually deteriorated over the following years, and by 1905, Emma had moved out of Maplecroft entirely, ending the once close bond between them for reasons no outsider ever fully learned. Some researchers point to an unusually close friendship Lizzie developed with an actress named Nance O'Neill in the years after the trial, a friendship, or perhaps something more, that Emma reportedly disapproved of, contributing to the growing distance between the sisters. Lizzie Borden died on June 1, 1927, at age 66 from complications of pneumonia following gallbladder surgery. In an eerie coincidence, Emma, the sister who'd lived estranged from Lizzie for more than 20 years, died just days later at a nursing home far from Fall River from complications related to chronic kidney disease. Two sisters who had once faced one of the most famous trials in American history together died less than 2 weeks apart without ever having reconciled during those final 2 decades. In her will, Lizzie left most of her estate to local animal welfare organizations, a choice many see as reflecting the deep loneliness of her final years, when connection with other people seemed to have run dry, while her affection for animals remained intact to the end. More than 130 years later, this remains a question no researcher, author, or documentary filmmaker has ever definitively answered to everyone's agreement. But over the decades, a handful of theories have stood out more than the rest. The most widely held theory among case researchers, though never proven in court, remains that Lizzie herself did it. Supporters of this theory point to a long list of details. She was the only person confirmed to have been continuously present in the house all morning. There was no sign of outside forced entry. Her account of her own whereabouts kept shifting, and none of it was ever corroborated by an independent witness. And burning a dress in the middle of a police investigation is a hard decision to explain away if she was genuinely innocent. The motive, under this theory, centers on the family's long-running property dispute. The fear that her father would keep transferring assets to Abby's side of the family, stripping away the inheritance Lizzie believed rightfully belonged to her. But there's another theory, one many modern researchers have taken far more seriously in recent decades, carrying a far more complicated and painful shade than a simple financial motive. The possibility that Lizzie endured some form of abuse from her own father over the years. Though direct evidence for this theory is virtually non-existent, it rests heavily on behavioral analysis, on the suffocating atmosphere many described inside the house at 92 2nd Street, and on the sheer, unusual brutality of the murders themselves. The level of rage expressed in each blow, especially to Andrew Borden's face, which some modern forensic psychologists argue is more often associated with deeply personal killings, driven by long accumulated resentment, rather than a murder motivated by money alone. Supporters of this theory often point to a string of circumstantial details. The sisters repeatedly vacationing away from home in the months before the murders. Lizzie choosing to stay 4 days at a rooming house rather than going straight home even after returning to the city. The unusual coldness between the sisters and a stepmother they'd never once called mother in nearly 30 years living together, and the fact that neither sister ever married, despite coming from a wealthy family, at an age when most women of their social class had long since done so. None of these details on their own prove anything, but taken together, they sketch a picture of a household that, behind its respectable middle-class facade, may have concealed things no outsider ever knew. And if this theory is true, then the case itself, while still an act of brutal murder, carries an entirely different layer of tragedy. Not a story about greed, but the story of a woman who, after years with no other way out, within the deeply restrictive confines Victorian society placed on unmarried women, ultimately chose violence as the only path to her own freedom. It's important to stress this remains only a theory, not an established fact, and Lizzie Borden herself, legally, to this day, remains a woman who was acquitted by a court of law. Raising this theory isn't meant to assert her guilt, but to show that even if she really was the one who did it, the story behind that act, if it exists, may be far more complicated and deserving of understanding than the simple murderer for money image the nursery rhyme has boxed her into for more than a century. Beyond that, a few other theories have surfaced over the years. The possibility that Bridget Sullivan, the maid, was responsible over some conflict that was never known, though this theory lacks a convincing motive, and Bridget was never seriously treated as an official suspect. The possibility that John Morse, the uncle staying over the night before, was involved, though he had a reasonably solid alibi for that morning. Some researchers have pointed a finger at Emma herself, the sister who was absent that day but inherited equally alongside Lizzie, and who knew better than anyone the tensions simmering in the family for years, though her alibi in Fairhaven was confirmed by several independent witnesses. And there's even a theory, more literary speculation than serious research, involving an illegitimate son of Andrew Borden's who might have broken in seeking a share of the inheritance. Among the strangest theories ever recorded is the story of a man named Joseph LeMay, who claimed that about 12 days after the murders, while walking through a deep forest several miles outside the city, he heard someone crying out, over and over, "Poor Mrs. Borden! Poor Mrs. Borden!" Looking over a stone wall, he saw a man with bloodstains on his shirt holding a hatchet, who shook it threateningly at him before vanishing into the woods. LeMay's story was never taken seriously by credible researchers, but it's still often retold in books and documentaries about the case. A fitting illustration of how, from the very first days, the public craved some kind of stranger to pin the blame on, rather than face the far more painful possibility that the killer, if there was just one, was a member of the family itself. None of these theories has ever been proven beyond reasonable doubt. Not long after the trial, some anonymous author, never definitively identified even to this day, composed the four-line rhyme about Lizzie Borden took an axe. For reasons that remain unclear, the song spread with astonishing speed through schoolyards across America, becoming part of children's jump rope culture for generations afterward, despite describing an extremely violent double parricide. It's a cultural phenomenon worth pausing on. One of the most brutal murder cases in 19th century American history got condensed, in the collective memory of millions of people, into a catchy jump rope song with an easy-to-remember rhyme. The number of blows in the song, 40 and 41, doesn't match the actual forensic figures at all, 18 to 19 for Abby, 10 to 11 for Andrew. But that inaccurate number has become so deeply embedded in popular culture that today, most people, when they think of the case, remember 40 whacks, far more than they remember the two victims who actually died. That song, in a way, is the 19th century version of what would happen to Amityville nearly a century later. A real tragedy, with real victims, gradually stripped from its original painful context and turned into raw material for something lighter, easier to consume, and far more commercially friendly. Few cases in American history have inspired as many pop culture works across as many generations. From stage plays as early as the 1930s to the 1975 TV movie The Legend of Lizzie Borden starring Elizabeth Montgomery, to the Lifetime films Lizzie Borden Took an Axe and The Lizzie Borden Chronicles in the mid-2010s, to the independent film Lizzie in 2018 starring Chloe Sevigny. Every generation seems to feel the need to retell this story in its own way, reflecting exactly the cultural preoccupations of whatever era they're living in. Notably, the way America has viewed Lizzie Borden has shifted significantly across those different eras. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, she was usually portrayed as a cold-blooded killer, a terrifying deviation from Victorian femininity. But by the late 20th and early 21st centuries, many works, especially the 2018 film Lizzie, began portraying her far more sympathetically, as a woman trapped inside a suffocating patriarchal system who may have endured years of control or abuse, with the act of violence, if she really did commit it, framed almost as a desperate act of self-liberation rather than a simple crime for money. That shift in storytelling is, in itself, an interesting signal that every generation tends to remake the past in the image of its own contemporary anxieties and values, a phenomenon that will resurface in several other episodes of the Marked series. If Amityville's commercialization of tragedy happened through books and films, the Borden cases happened in a far more direct and literal way. The house where the murders took place, at 92 2nd Street, still stands today, and since 1996, it has officially operated as a bed and breakfast and museum. Visitors from around the world can book an overnight stay right in the house, including the upstairs guest room where Abby Borden was killed, restored to look almost exactly as it did with the Borden's original Victorian furnishings. Breakfast is advertised as modeled on the actual meal the Borden family ate that fateful morning, though adjusted somewhat for modern palates. The house runs daily 90-minute guided tours, nighttime ghost hunts, Victorian-style tea parties, murder mystery dinner nights, and even has an area where guests can try axe throwing, turning the very murder weapon into a paid entertainment activity. Every August, right around the anniversary of the murders, the house runs a whole series of publicly advertised events branded the Murderversary, a mashup of murder and anniversary, drawing true crime enthusiasts from across the country to Fall River for commemorative activities with far more of a festival atmosphere than genuine remembrance. There's no denying the house is carefully preserved and maintained, or that many of its tour guides are genuinely knowledgeable about the case's history and present it with a certain amount of respect. But it's also hard to deny that the distance between commemorating a tragedy and turning the scene of a double murder into a paid entertainment destination where you can sleep overnight in the exact spot where a 64-year-old woman was hacked to death, that distance, if it exists at all, has worn so thin it's barely recognizable anymore. Amid everything Lizzie Borden has become in pop culture, a name in a nursery rhyme, a haunted hotel brand, a character in dozens of films, plays, even an off-Broadway musical, there's something very easy to lose sight of. Andrew and Abby Borden were two real people who died in extreme agony on a summer morning in 1892, and who never truly received the justice any murder victim deserves. No one was ever convicted for their deaths. No satisfying explanation was ever offered for the real motive behind the case, and over more than a century since, the story of their two deaths has gradually been replaced in the collective memory of an entire nation by the story of the daughter under suspicion. A strange reversal that rarely happens in other cases. The suspected perpetrator, never convicted, became the central figure people remember, while the victims faded further into the background with each passing year. Perhaps the most thought-provoking thing the Borden case leaves behind, nearly a century before Amityville would repeat a similar pattern in a different form, is this. American society seems to have a particular talent for turning its most violent tragedies into the most palatable consumer products. A catchy song, an experience-filled weekend getaway, a t-shirt printed with a hatchet. As long as enough time has passed that the original pain no longer feels too close. The problem is, for Andrew and Abby Borden themselves, that passage of time does nothing to diminish the fact that they were once real people, with real lives, violently taken from them inside their own home. And for Lizzie Borden herself, whether or not she really was the one who did it, there's another injustice, far less discussed. A woman formally acquitted by the American legal system, according to its most basic principles of justice, who then had to spend the rest of her life as a convicted woman in the eyes of society, isolated, mocked, turned into the villain of a children's rhyme, with no legal mechanism able to protect her from that unofficial sentence. Guilty or innocent, that's still a punishment no fair justice system ever intended to impose. Convicted by public opinion for more than a century for a charge the court itself declared there wasn't enough evidence to prove. The Marked series exists partly for that reason, so that whenever we bring up a place that's become marked, we spend at least a few minutes remembering the real names behind it, both the victims and the people who were once suspected but never truly had the truth known about them, before moving on to whatever the public turned that story into. Because in the end, whether Andrew and Abby Borden are remembered through a distorted rhyme about the number of blows, or Lizzie continues to be seen through the lens of a children's song rather than as a complicated person whose life may have held a trauma never fully told, all three of them deserve to be spoken of by their real names, with the full complexity of a story that never has, and perhaps never will, truly come to a close. This is the second episode of the Marked series. If the last episode, about Amityville, was the story of a fake legend hiding a real tragedy, Fall River is, in a way, the opposite story. A real tragedy, never solved, dissolved into the laughter of a nursery rhyme and the ring of a hotel check-in bell. If you want to follow along to the next marked place in this series, leave a like. It genuinely gives me more motivation to keep researching each case thoroughly before I bring it to you. See you at the next place.